the Brexit vote in more depth and really to understand what it means for the UK and for the rest of the world. I'm now delighted to be joined by Martin Wolf, the Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times from London. Thank you very much, Mr. Wolf, for joining us here on The Big Picture. I know predictions can be, and especially predicting referendums can be notoriously difficult, but at this point in time, it seems that the Remain camp is just slightly ahead from the Leave camp, which suggests that there has perhaps been a change in the mood in the last few days. Do you think now there is a growing realization of the risks associated with Brexit? That's something that you have been, writing about in your columns.
Well, there are two hypotheses here. The first, that it's shifted back to Remain. The polls seem to be suggesting that's true, but it's very close, and we really don't know what the outcome will be. I hope it will be to Remain, but we can't be quite sure. Then the question is, why might this have happened? I think one possibility was the impact of this terrible murder of a member of Parliament last week, which reminded us of the passions of some on the Leave side. Another possibility is that people are focusing at last. Many voters were not really thinking about this till the last few days, and they're beginning to realize there are real risks, and that links to the third reason, which is the natural conservatism of many people. And we've seen in previous votes in the last few years that as it gets close to the outcome, people seem to be shifting in the more conservative direction. And if Remain wins, that would probably be a plausible explanation for that outcome.
Right. Mr. Wolf, there have been Eurosceptics within the EU since the time it joined the EU in the early 1970s. But clearly there has, something has fundamentally changed in the recent past, because earlier there were Eurosceptics, but that was primarily a very minority, a small section of the population held those views. But today you have at least 130 Conservative MPs who support the Leave campaign. What has happened in the last few years?
I think that's a very good question. I think there are two explanations. The first and most important is immigration. We have had, for the UK, record levels of immigration in the last 10 or 12 years, a net immigration of about 300,000 a year, which in relation to our population of a little over 60 million is a lot of people. And second, that immigration has been not at all stages. Non-EU immigration has actually been bigger than EU immigration net, but EU immigration has grown faster and has become very, very large in the last few years. So if you add those two things together, the scale of overall immigration and the role of EU immigration, which we can't control by treaty, we cannot have controls on the immigrants from the EU. That has created a whole new movement in the UK Independence Party, which is focusing on the immigration issue. That has then influenced Conservatives who are worried about losing their seats to the UK Independence Party or being affected by their success. So I think what has really changed in the last few years has mainly been immigration. There's one other factor, which is the UK economy has done relatively well, particularly in recent years. The Eurozone looks a terrible mess. That's become more obvious since the crisis. And because of that, the credibility of the EU as an economic organisation has declined. That has allowed Conservative MPs to say that we are, in the quotes, shackled to a corpse, and made them reject the EU for economic reasons. Taking these two things together, the relative failure of the EU economy and the scale of net immigration, including from the EU, I think that explains why Euroscepticism has become so strong among the people.
If indeed Brexit were to become a reality, Martin Wolf, tomorrow, then do you think it's going to give intellectual oxygen to many of these conservative right-wing, political parties that are spanning across Europe? Even in Sweden, we have seen, a lot of these parties coming out and taking a very anti-immigration stand. So if Brexit were to happen, will this automatically make them more legitimate across Europe?
I think nothing is automatic, but it's very likely to make them more legitimate. I think it would make the Eurosceptic forces across the continent, across Europe, more credible. It would make the anti-immigration stance more credible. It would make leaving the EU more credible. Britain is the second largest country and the second largest economy in the European Union. It's a large and credible democracy in the European context. So if a country like that were to decide to leave, it would clearly have influence in northern European countries, in Scandinavia, and the Netherlands, which in some ways are culturally quite similar to Britain. And I think it would also have an impact in France and possibly elsewhere too. So yes, I think one of the dangers of a Brexit vote is that it would increase the desire to leave elsewhere, weaken the European Union, and that, in my view, would be very dangerous.
Right. One of the arguments the UKIP has been constantly making is that because of this immigration from the lesser developed countries within the EU, it has depressed the wages. You are the economists. Is there any statistical truth to this?
This is a very controversial argument among economists. I think what one has to say is that the evidence that wages have been depressed is weak. It's not decisive. It is important to note that we have a minimum wage, and it's quite effective. We also have wage subsidies through tax credits, and that puts a floor under wages. So to some degree, if we have a large number of relatively unskilled workers coming into the country, they can't depress wages too much. It is also worth noting that we have pretty close to full employment. So it doesn't look as though these immigrants have been pushing British workers into unemployment either. So it looks as though the impact in that respect, there may well have been some, possibly on the willingness to train young people. That's a concern that I've had, that we might import people rather than training them. Perhaps in the middle levels of the labour market, construction workers particularly, building workers, people like that, the impact might have been more significant. But what we're seeing doesn't suggest a huge impact on the labour market. It should be said, however, that this scale of immigration, about 300,000 a year net, has an effect elsewhere. It clearly increases congestion in our economy, increases the pressure on infrastructure, public services. At the same time, many of these workers work in our public services and improve things. The net effect doesn't look, other than from a purely social and cultural aspect, doesn't look that large. The fear, I think, is somewhat exaggerated, and maybe this has been driven by other anxieties as well. The fright created by the financial crisis, and of course the big recession we had in 2009, 10 and 11. And people haven't forgotten these things yet. In a few years, it might have passed.
Right, and those are very important words you're telling us, Mr. Wolf, because there was an impression that within UK the workers were getting increasingly insecure, especially at a time when manufacturing jobs at least on paper were shrinking, especially with the crisis in the steel sector. And then on top of that, the double whammy was that many workers from the lesser developed European countries were coming and taking away the jobs. But I want to ask you, the other big concern that many people in the Brexit camp have had, that's with respect to the sovereignty of the United Kingdom, because many of the important issues of competition laws, agriculture, patents, that is decided by the European Commission. So in that sense, do you feel that at least if, irrespective of what happens, for instance, if at all the Remain camp does prevail over the Leave camp, there is, however, a need to look into some of the larger issues that have actually come out in the course of this debate. For instance, the one that I told you, that many of these issues like competition, agriculture, is looked into by a European Commission.
May I make one previous point on manufacturing? It's important to remember the steel industry employs almost nobody in our economy anymore. We're talking about a few tens of thousands in a labour force of nearly 30 million. So it's obviously nothing like India, but the manufacturing is really a very small part of the employment in our economy now, and that's for other reasons to do with globalization, the changes in trade patterns which have been going on for 30 or 35 years. Now, people are upset about that, I understand it, but it really isn't about Europe. It's about the whole globalization process. In this context, China is more important than the European Union, I would argue. Is the sovereignty issue a serious one? Yes, I think it is a serious one. The point here is you have to make a balance. Britain gains, in my view, significantly from being part of the European single market and having preferential access to this huge market, the biggest market actually in the world. Now, part of doing that is that we have to share the same regulatory framework. That's what makes internal free trade possible. If you don't have the same regulatory framework, completely free trade is very difficult. And the same applies to agriculture. Now, that means we have to make rules together. That's not made by the European Commission. I must correct you. The Commission may propose these rules, but they're ultimately agreed by the Council and the Parliament, in both of which the UK is very heavily represented. We have a very big voice. We're a big country. But of course, it is true that in some cases, rarely actually, we are outvoted and we get rules imposed upon us that we don't want. But in return, we get access to this market, and the competition policy, without a doubt, has improved the quality of competition in the whole European market. Now, what you have to do then is to strike a balance. I take the view sovereignty can never be absolute. If you're part of the world economy, you're an open trading nation like Britain. We are an open and prosperous trading nation. You have to accept, even in the World Trade Organization, you have to accept rules that others want to have, otherwise they won't trade with us. In the EU, it's even more like that. The detailed analysis that has been done strongly suggests that the competencies that we've transferred to the European Union are appropriate and reasonable, and therefore the loss of sovereignty is also appropriate and reasonable. But Britain as a country has in many ways, including in NATO, handed over important dimensions of its security and its economy to collective agreements, and the price of that is that your sovereignty is limited, more limited, and the benefit is access to market and the sharing of powers and the voice you have in other countries' policies. I think that is a very reasonable and sensible bargain. It's a perfectly legitimate point of discussion as long as you don't take an absolutist principle. Absolute sovereignty for an integrated absolutely unavailable.
All right, Mr. Wold, we have to leave it at that. Thank you so very much for joining us here on The Big Picture and giving us your opinion. Clearly, your opinion matters, and we need to wait and watch. Another 13 hours from now, we will know exactly which way the vote goes.